I want to begin by acknowledging what a privilege it is to be in conversation with Dr. Verghese to begin with, but to be in conversation with Dr. Verghese in Kerala. And again, to be in conversation with Dr. Verghese in Kerala about the covenant of water with the water right in front of us. So these are truly very, very special things to me. It seems to me that Kerala itself is practically a character in your novel. And so I really am happy that we get to bring your novel home in this conversation. And therefore, I want to begin by talking about specifically the water, Dr. Verghese. The Covenant of Water is a book that draws so much from the sort of bloodlines of water. And I wonder if this was something consciously that you did, that the idea that trauma also flows through generations a bit like water, and the significance of water to you as well.
Thank you. A real privilege to be talking to you. I want to start out by apologizing to many people I know who are coming at 4 o'clock, but as you have just discovered, as I've discovered, we are on at 3 o'clock. I can't tell you why, I don't have an explanation, but apologies to the people who are going to come and be quite disappointed, I suspect, because they're coming from a certain distance. But thank you all for being here. There are no writers without readers, and so it's you who make my writing possible. So thank you so much for that. To answer your question, I don't think I begin a novel with notions like, trauma running through water and so on. I think it's much simpler than that. My goal in writing a novel is very simply a good story well told. That's all you can do. And it's really fascinating how later people ascribe to you lots of motives and they see all kinds of patterns, which is wonderful. And so I have a theory that, as writers, we provide the words and the reader provides their imagination. And somewhere in middle space, this mental movie takes place in the head of the reader. And it's very much their movie. So, what you saw as trauma flowing through generations is a lovely idea, but I would be lying if I said that I began with any such notion. I think it's very hard to write about Kerala without invoking water. I mean, as you all know, this is a very narrow strip of coastal territory, and we have 44 rivers coming down from the Western Ghats to the ocean, but breaking into all these ponds and tributaries. So it's almost impossible to not invoke water as a metaphor for character, for place. So I think that we came to the title pretty late. It seemed obvious that water should be in the title, and covenant seemed like a mysterious enough word that it stood in for many different things. Again, up to the reader what they choose to invoke with that word, covenant. I hope that answers your question.
I think it does, but I'd love to stay with the theme of water a little bit here, because without giving too much away to this audience, I think water plays an even more central role than being part of the landscape. It's very central to one of the most important mysteries in the novel. And again, without giving too much away, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the medical mystery that is at the heart of this novel.
Yeah, I mean, I think water is elemental in all our lives. We gestate in our mother's womb for 9 months in a liquid environment, in water. Our bodies are made up of 2/3 of water. So even if you weren't living in Kerala, water is pretty fundamental. You can fast for many, many days, but you can't not drink water. You'd be gone in a few days. And so I think water is primal. But I love the idea of water as a metaphor in my novel, because as many of you are aware, people in Kerala often will swim before they walk. I mean, they're really so at home with water. Water is the great highway that connects people. Water is elemental in people's lives. You rely on the monsoon every year to feed all these rivers. And so I thought it would be really interesting to introduce in this multi-generation story, to introduce a medical condition that made it difficult for people to be around water without drowning. And so, as a long-time teacher of medicine, I keep a lot of rare diseases in my back pocket. I mean, not literally. Don't worry, I'm not about to unleash something on you. But, whenever there's a dull moment on rounds, I will often ask a question in the form of a riddle, such as, what disease is passed down from generation to generation? Better? Okay. What disease is passed down from generation to generation that causes people to drown, one member or more of the family drowning in every generation? So I was very aware of that disease for many years. And so it seemed like an interesting ploy to introduce that disease early on in the book. One of the great joys for me in practicing medicine for 40-something years is the delight in seeing conditions that when I was a medical student, we only had a name for, but no understanding. And then as time went on, we had a cellular understanding. Then as time went on, we had a molecular understanding of the mechanism. And then ultimately, we've had a cure. And it's been the most gratifying thing for me in my career to watch that unfolding. And so in my story, I very much wanted to have several generations so that the first generation would have the condition, but the last generation, the third, would actually solve the condition. By the way, can you hear me pretty well at the back there? It's okay? Thank you.
So this thing that you just talked about, which is at some point we find a cure, I want to stick a pin in that and come back to that later, because the idea of healing is also quite central to the novel, not just for the medical condition, but for all kinds of things. So we'll come back to that. But just sticking with the medical condition as well, your background as a medical professional certainly informs this novel. There's an almost surgical precision, I think, in which you're able to establish the human relationships that are at the heart of the novel. But also, your background as a medical professional is so central to so many of the experiences that these characters undergo. I wonder, at what point do you stop being a doctor and start being a writer, or does that never happen? Are you always both?
Great question. But before I answer that, may I ask if we can have these fans turned on? I was at the same stage yesterday with a full house, and we actually had the fans on. If anybody's listening to us.
Yeah, I think someone is.
So the question was really about medicine and what role it plays. I must say that I think sometimes we make too much of the fact that I'm a physician, in the sense that, we don't really, people don't get as worked up when it's a school teacher, architect, or, somebody else who's a writer. But I think there's something very curious about people's reactions to a physician writing, almost as though either we shouldn't be doing it or something slightly mysterious. But that said, I think that I never intended to be a writer. It was never on my radar. But I lived through a very unusual experience early in the HIV era when I was an infectious disease physician in a small town in America. And we had an unexpected number of HIV patients in that small rural town when HIV was considered an urban disease. And it was a bit of a mystery. And it turned out that the mystery was very simply that these were young men, gay men, who were leaving their hometowns for the same reasons you and I leave hometowns. But in their case, they were leaving for jobs, education, opportunity. And they went to the big city and found themselves and were able to live that lifestyle without being under the close scrutiny of their friends and relatives. But tragically, at some point, the virus found them, decades later, typically. And so they were now typically returning to their hometowns because their partners had gotten sick and died, and now they were ill, and there was no other recourse for them, so they were coming home. And I wrote a scientific paper describing this phenomenon of migration. And the paper was widely cited, and it was the first paper to say this is happening in every small town in America. But even as I wrote the paper, I felt that the cold, unimaginative language of science did not begin to capture the tragic nature of this voyage, did not begin to capture the heartache of the families, did not begin to capture my own grief at caring for young men who were my age at the time and watching them inevitably succumb over many, many months. And so I became a writer to tell that story. And people often ask me if I wear two different hats. Am I a writer or a physician? And I think that for the longest time, I would answer that I'm all physician, that anything I write comes from the same standpoint of being a physician. But I would, I guess it's pretty disingenuous now because I'm clearly at the Kerala Book Festival, so I'm not here as a physician, even though I'm here at the wrong time, but that's another story. And so, I think I am effectively a writer, but I can't help that my point of view is very much informed by being a physician. I think there are no special advantages to being a physician, except that if there are any, it's that you've been trained to, sort of make observations. You take all these disparate things that you notice and you pull them together, applying Occam's razor, kind of like making a unifying diagnosis. But I think that you're not given anything just because you're a physician. I think there's a lot of physician manuscripts that I get sent, and many of them are really quite dismal, in the sense that there's a sense that physicians, feel like they can write a novel without ever bothering to have been readers and really understand what the threshold is for a good story. And so they say everybody has a novel in them. Many of those should probably stay in them. I don't know. Again, I don't want to seem facetious or arrogant, but there is a certain discipline and hard work and lots of reading you have to do before you can presume that you want to write. At least for me, that was true. And so I think it had nothing to do with being a physician as much as it did having a great respect for the written word, a great respect for writers who can pull it off, and trying my best to emulate them and see what it is they were doing that made that so moving to me.
You just spoke about your work with HIV, and you bring so much empathy in your writings on that subject as well. And even in this novel, I think that you pay quite special attention to the marginalized body. Some of the diseases that you describe in this novel are diseases of stigmatization and ostracism. These are some medical, you go talk at length about the subject of leprosy, for example, and that is a disease which has been at the center of social stigma. There's one of the most delightful characters in the book is Baby Mole, who also is, who occupies a body that is, absolutely delightful to the reader, but at the same time, we know so little about the condition that she undergoes. This empathy that you bring to it, I wonder if that is because of your medical profession, because I haven't really experienced that much empathy for the marginalized body as I have while reading your novel.
Well, you're very kind to say so, but I could rattle off a number of writers that I greatly admire who I think achieve what you're describing. Perhaps the difference is that I am taking on medical conditions head on, not for no other reason that certain diseases like leprosy, for example, absolutely fascinate me. There's a long history and tradition of leprosy and leprosy medicine, and it has always intrigued me, especially the part where, as a child growing up in Africa, growing up in India, it was commonplace to see lepers come begging for alms, and I remember being frightened by their somewhat scary external appearance. But when I was a medical student and saw the example of physicians caring for them and realized that this was not anywhere as contagious as I had imagined, I also began to see that behind that very scary exterior was an individual just like me or you. and that the most terrible insult of leprosy was not so much the disfigurement, but what was happening to their soul because of the rejection by everybody around them. So again, I think that empathy is or should be natural to anybody who delves into this to any degree. But I appreciate you saying that. I must say, Baby Moll, the character in the book Baby Moll, is one of my favorite characters, and I was inspired to a great degree by my brother's daughter, my niece, who has autism. And my brother always says about her, and I think it's very true, that she always lives in the moment. You know, there is no past, there is no future for her. She's eternally happy, by and large. And I think it's a quality that my brother and his wife bring to their appreciation of who she is rather than who she should be, that I wanted to try and capture in the character of Baby Moll. You know, we have to meet people where they are with the abilities that they have.
And just to circle out the conversation on the medical bit, we're in Kerala, as I said when we started out this conversation, and Kerala has a remarkable healthcare system. It's incredibly modern, incredibly efficient, but at the same time, there's a lot of amazing traditional healing work that also happens. Traditional healing work that also happens in Kerala. So I wonder, how did you bring all of that in, or did you seek to bring all of that into this novel as well? Because there are medical professionals in this novel who are, again, incredibly empathetic, but also they are not geographically from India, but so deeply rooted in the terrain that they operate in.
Well, I mean, I was setting the novel in the period 1900 to 1976, and I was really trying to be true to the times. So what is true of the early part of that time period is that much of the Western medicine was by expatriate physicians in the British Medical Service, British Medical Healthcare Service. And, it was mixed in with physicians trained in India by them, largely in medical schools started by them. I mean, I went to Madras Medical College and it was founded in 1798 or something. But again, founded by expatriate British physicians, and it took many generations for that to change. So I was really trying to be true to the times and reflect the mix of medical care, both, the local Ayurvedic or Siddha and homeopathic tradition, as well as the allopathic Western tradition. I don't think I was trying to do much more than that.
So let's come back to the subject of healing. The other thing that I think is quite central to the novel is, as I said, secrets, trauma that kind of goes from one generation to another. And I get the feeling that family secrets are, I don't know, like they are a little bit like diseases, right? They spread in that way. And I mean, how did you create this really complicated family structure and secret? How did that happen?
Well, I think if you are going to describe an uncomplicated family history, then there's really nothing much to talk about. I think it was Tolstoy who said that happy families are all alike, but unhappy families are, not alike, and they're each different in very different ways. I think I remember as a child being very conscious of the fact that family reputation was everything, and so for the marriage prospects of a young woman more than a young man, the slightest thing could ruin that reputation. If there was a murmur of, there's seizures or fits in that family, or the slightest murmur of, whatever, criminality or something, it could simply torpedo the marriage prospects for that individual. And so I think there was a sense that families keep secrets, not particularly well. And I think it just sort of went along with my introducing this disease to make it something that they tried to be secretive about. And by the way, that's actually fairly common with disease. Every disease has a metaphor. So there's a very famous book by Susan Sontag called Illness as Metaphor. as she points out, that historically, diseases like tuberculosis were viewed as slightly romantic. I mean, who got tuberculosis? It was Keats, it was people like that. Whereas cancer was viewed as some sort of personal failing. Obviously, not true. But this sort of came home to me in the HIV era, because the metaphor of HIV was shame and secrecy. The metaphor was one of something that these individuals had done that somehow the moral climate disapproved of, and here they had this illness, and so I became very conscious of the notion of metaphor and illness. And perhaps that's why when I introduced this condition into my family, I was very conscious of what it meant to have this condition, which, most illness by itself, the tuberculous bacillus, the leprosy bacillus, doesn't think of itself emotionally. It just does what it does, We're the ones who give it the metaphor.
And there are other family secrets too, in this particular family. And I mean, I don't know that they are an unhappy family. I think they are so often a happy family that it's hard to think of them as an unhappy family either. Do you think all families just have secrets? Is that something that you think is at the center of your philosophy as well?
Well, I think in the conceit of my novel, this family did. I certainly don't think that's true of all families, but I think there's a facade, a front that every family presents to the world, and you're not always aware of all the undercurrents unless you're part of the family. It's just, call that a secret. I think if you're a novelist, it's always wonderful to have some sort of a secret that blossoms, out somewhere. John Irving wrote a beautiful foreword to one of Dickens' books. I think it was Great Expectations. And he said, the thing about every Dickens novel is there was always one truth of which the main character was unaware. And there was a certain moment when the truth that was known to everybody else became revealed to the character. Pip, for example, finds out that who his father really is. And I think you can call that a device, or you can call it a secret. But I think, every story needs some sort of conflict, some sort of tension, and you could do it in many different ways. But this is one time-honored way, I suppose.
But also to move this more into slightly more of the philosophical realm, I wonder if to not keep it a secret would be to take away the power of that great shame or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't doubt that it would. But human nature being what it is, it's a lot to ask of people to be very objective. So in my HIV practice early on, I had the misfortune to have to tell one young man that is memorable. I had to tell him one day that his HIV test had come back positive. He was devastated. I was so worried about him that I asked him to come back the next day so we could talk some more. But in that era, 1985 or so, to be HIV positive was to have a death sentence. And because there was no medications, there were no treatments we had to offer. All we could do is treat infections that developed. And he didn't come back the next day. Instead, the previous night, he went to a nightclub, pulled out a gun, and the police were obliged to shoot him down. So he went down in a blaze of glory, and so there's actually a name for this now. It's called suicide by police. Because in America, if you pull out a gun, even a toy gun, or something that someone thinks is a gun, you will in very short order be killed without any, particular variation. And I always thought of him as having been killed by the metaphor. He was actually quite healthy outwardly at the time. It would have been years before the virus affected him. But human nature being what it was, the metaphor of shame and secrecy in that small town being what it was, he was unwilling to suffer it. And he chose to die rather than reveal the secret of his lifestyle that might have led him to this. So, I think in the abstract, secrets are better served by being open about them. But, tell me how often that really happens.
Uh, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the women in the novel. And of course, the most important character in
Sorry,
the novel.
about the...
The women in the novel.
Yeah.
And of course, the most important character in the novel is our wonderful Big Amachi. Is she based on someone you know? I noticed that the novel is dedicated to someone whose name is quite similar to Big Amachi's name, which incidentally we don't find out until page 400 or something. But I wondered if you've been inspired by some of the women in your life.
Well, I was actually inspired to write this book because of a extraordinary manuscript that my mother, in her 70s, left or wrote for her 5-year-old granddaughter and namesake, my niece. And so when my niece was 5 years old, she turned to my mother and said, and they were living in America then, and said to my mother, "Amachi, what was it like when you were a small child?" And my mother was just taken aback by this question. How does she describe to a 5-year-old girl living in America what life was like in Maraman, in Kumbanad, without electricity, without water, which was not a great deprivation, mind you. All the time I was a child, there was no electricity, there was no water, but it was the most romantic thing to have the house lit up by lights every night and, to haul water from the well for your bath outside the well. And so my mother, in trying to convey this, my mother was a school teacher, she began to write longhand, anecdotes of her childhood, many of which were familiar to my brothers and to me, except that now they had become much embellished and slightly exaggerated over time. And my mother was also a very talented artist, and so she had these quick pencil sketches, which we have tried to reproduce in the book, so that her 5-year-old niece would have a sense of what this was like. And when I was fishing around for my second novel after finishing Cutting for Stone, I had picked up this manuscript again, my mom's manuscript, and many years had passed. My mom was no longer 70, she was in her 90s. And I suddenly had this epiphany that, Kerala is such a rich, unique geography. I mean, just unique. And on top of that, Malayalis, all of us are quite unique in our characters and our identities, shaped by the geography. And also that within the many subsets of Malayalis, the small group of Syrian Christians were sort of a unique microcosm, retaining many Hindu traditions in their rituals and yet, having a different form of worship. And so I decided to set my story there. So I was very much inspired by my mother. If you can picture my mother, she was a young college graduate in the 1940s, just about the time India got independence from centuries of colonization, but there were no jobs to be had. And my mother saw an ad for a teaching position in Ethiopia. She had no idea where Ethiopia was. And can you imagine a young woman in a sari setting off by steamship to Aden and then God knows how to Ethiopia? So she was obviously a very brave woman, and my father saw the same ad. He came 2 weeks later. And so in part this was a tribute to my mother and that manuscript, but actually much more than my mother, I was tremendously influenced in the story by both my grandmothers. Both my grandmothers were, the world will never know about my grandmothers, just like many of you know heroic women in your lives that the world will never know about, but you know about them. Both my grandmothers were extraordinarily strong women. They had both suffered terrible tragedy. My mother's mother lost her only son, 3 daughters and a son, lost her only son to typhoid fever when he was 9. My father's mother lost her eldest son to rabies. My father has a memory at 5 years of age of his brother shooing off a dog that was threatening them, and the dog nipped him before it left. And a month later, he developed a raging encephalitis, which was in retrospect rabies. So these women had suffered unspeakable tragedy, and yet their faith was solid. I mean, you would be envious of that kind of faith. It was like a rock. It was not just a ephemeral belief system. It was something that they rested their life on. And as a result, they were incredibly important pillars of the family that held it all together through all this trauma. And so, I said earlier that my goal was simply a good story well told, but there was this other motive that I wanted to pay tribute to the kind of heroic women who have been so important in my life, now and before, and especially to my grandmothers, who I thought, represented a kind of strength in Kerala that is really at the heart of the success of so many Keralites, at the heart of literacy, at the heart of so many things. And so, I think Big Amachi was inspired by all those elements, all those people coming together, embodied in this one character.
And I think you've mentioned somewhere that these sketches are also by your cousin, in fact, ultimately. The sketches in the book are have been done by your cousin, I think.
Yeah. So my first cousin, second cousin, is a wonderful artist himself. And so we wanted to reproduce Mom's simple sketches. They were actually extraordinary. If she had spent more time on them, they would have been even more marvelous. But my cousin, Thomas Verghese, did his best to emulate her sketches, but with a little more finish, where, every single section of the book, and there are 10, has one of these sketches to open the section. Yeah, so that was also very much a tribute to Mom, and the book is dedicated to Mom. So Mom, my mother, was in her 90s when I told her I'm setting the book in Kerala. She could not have been more excited. She was so thrilled. She became my #1 research assistant, doing all kinds of background stuff for me, but mostly sharing stories. And even a few days before she died, she called me up to tell me some anecdote that she just remembered. And I didn't have the heart to tell her that the previous day she told me the same anecdote, And so it's really sad that Mom never got to see the finished work. But sometime after the book came out, and it was very lucky, after some really bad breaks with this book, to have it do extraordinarily well by my standards, by any standard. And I turned to my dad, who, by the way, is 99 years old and goes walking every day, or used to till a few weeks ago. I said to my dad, "Dad, this book is done so well. Mom must be watching over this." I said it somewhat facetiously. And my dad turned on me. He said, "Of course she is." There was no question about it. And I think it's that kind of concreteness of faith that my parents' generation, but especially their parents' generation, represented, that I think is at the heart of the book, and why so many people resonate with that idea.
Absolutely. That's such a beautiful thing. Thank you for sharing that with us. You've also spoken a little bit about how the character you identify with the most is Philippus, who I might argue is possibly the most unsympathetic of the main characters in the novel. So I find that admission really fascinating. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think perhaps I've been quoted, not incorrectly, but sort of taken a little bit out of context. I remember that when the New York Times reviewed my book, it was a very generous review by someone I know who probably should have, recused himself from being the reviewer. I do. If I know somebody pretty well, I say, I can't do this review. So he was overall generous, but he couldn't resist taking a few shots at me here and there, And one of the shots he took at me was that all my characters, he said, were all good people, that I didn't have any real villains in the book. And at first I was really, insulted by that. But then as I thought about it, I felt, he's right. I don't think that there is anybody who wakes up one morning and says, "I'm going to be the villain today." Even people who are really villainous, by and large feel justified doing what they're doing. You know, whether it's somebody who's, I don't know, cheating people in a big scam, or whether it's the leader of a modern country, they feel very motivated that what they're doing is the right thing. I remember there was a famous interview with, I think it was Lee, I want to say Lee Marvin, but it was a Lee somebody. He was very famous for playing the role of villain in the movies. And when he was in his older years, someone asked him, a reporter asked him, Mr. So-and-so, why is it that you always played the villain in these movies? And he turned on the reporter and said, son, I never played a villain in my life. You know, and I think that's the way to do it. You know, the villain, to be convincing to you and me, has to be completely convinced of their role, that they're not the ones who label themselves villains. So that said, I think of all the characters in the book, I mean, I identify with Philippos because he's obviously flawed, but so many of the other characters were too. He's obviously made terrible mistakes that he regrets, which I think is true of many of us. And he's seeking redemption. So, I mean, I truly believe that there aren't really any evil people in the world, that, you know, for the most part, most of us who have any insight recognize when we screwed up. We may not have recognized it then, but we see it now. And we're seeking a form of redemption. So in that sense, I think Philippos was a character that I truly identified with.
The other character, or the relationship actually, that I want to zero in on is the relationship between Philippos and Jopan. And to me, one of the most absolutely remarkable conversations in the book takes place between the two of them. They've been friends since childhood, but I think Jopan holds Philippos to account in a way that perhaps he has never been held to account before in his life. And he probably comes into this conversation imagining himself to be quite a benevolent person, right? And I think no matter how much they love each other, that relationship seems to be eclipsed by the long shadow of caste. So again, Dr. Verghese, I will ask you, can there be healing from this long shadow of caste?
Yeah, I mean, so caste was something that I really, wanted to focus on, not because I have an agenda, but because you really can't write about India without, and in the 1900s or 1970s, without having some awareness of, a certain strata of people oppressing the strata below them and onwards. And then the British came along and oppressed everybody without caste or bar. But as a child visiting Kerala every summer, spending 2-3 months here, it was striking to me that the children I played with weren't necessarily invited into the house. So even though we were supposedly Christians and Jesus loves everybody, Jesus didn't seem to love everybody equally. There was a slight difference between Jesus' love. And it was not lost on me that this was really weird. My parents could sort of see my point of view, but weren't able to sort of give me a explanation. My grandparents, of course, were blind to it. To them, this was always the way it was, And I think it was very important to me to bring that sort of tension into the book, not for the sake of it, but because I think it's an important moment. And so when Philippos, who thinks of himself as a generous character, realizes that his best friend actually does not feel that the family has been generous to him, they've given him some land, they've done this and that, he says, and so the point is that the worst slaveholders in America, for example, were not the ones who abused their slaves, but the ones who thought that they were being kind to their slaves, which allowed them to be free of any sense of conscience or duty to undo the system. And so Jopan, as you astutely have come to, makes this long speech to his best friend from childhood to say, as much as I love you, this is something that you're not seeing. You're just blind to the fact that because you treat me well, you think you treat me well, that everything is all right. But if I were your cousin, as opposed to someone in a caste below yours, would your giving me this small plot of land and a hut seem generous when I've been taking care of your property for so many years, you know? So I think I had some particular delight in writing that section because I learned a lot. I read a lot of liberation theology. I read a lot about Indian sort of communal politics. But it was interesting how universal this was in every culture. In fact, for those of you who are interested, there's a beautiful book by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste. And it really is talking about caste all across the world. And she deliberately said that when she was writing that book, she was looking for a word that wasn't as loaded as, racial prejudice or racism. And she decided, inspiredly, I think, to pick caste. And it's a beautiful word to pick how we base many of the ways we treat other people.
As I'm listening to you talk right now, I'm reminded of the audiobook. So when I knew I was going to be talking to you here, I was going to reread the book. And then to my delight, I discovered that you narrated the audiobook. So I decided to listen to the audiobook to refresh my memory of the book. And you are so marvelous. I mean, you get every accent perfectly, and it's just such a delight to listen to you narrate. I highly recommend it for those of you who are interested. But a thing that I certainly took notice of while listening to the audiobook is I got the impression that you were frequently emotionally overwhelmed in the narration of the audiobook. I'm particularly thinking of one scene which involves, I won't say too much, but it involves a plavu tree. And I remember having to pause just to take it in with you almost, because I felt you were as emotionally overwhelmed by that scene in the narration as I was in the listening to it. Can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. Normally fiction writers are not allowed to record their audiobooks. It doesn't happen for good reasons. I mean, because you want novels to be performed by good actors typically. So, Anne Patchett's latest book is performed by Meryl Streep. Cormac McCarthy's books, one of them is performed by Brad Pitt, because you want actors who can do this. But, I had the experience of listening to the audiobook of my previous novel, Cutting for Stone, set in Ethiopia, and I was really distressed because there were subtle things that were happening that not everybody would pick up on, but really bothered me. For example, the guy recording it was North Indian, and he would, every time he said Madras, he said it Madras in that contemptuous way that people in the North say Madras, a city that I love, And so when it was time for the audiobook of this book, I said to the producers, I would like to give this a shot for these reasons. It's full of ethnic terms. There's all kinds of, Malayalam, Tamil, other terms in there. And if you find someone who can do it better, by all means, but let me have a chance. And so they let me record a demo tape, and they decided that I should do it, which I was delighted to. But I had to learn how to do this. I had to learn how to convey that it's a woman or a man talking by changing slightly the pitch of my voice, not totally, but just enough to recognize the difference. I had to learn to do different accents, but not too much. I had to learn how to pronounce many phrases, including in Malayalam. And as you know, Malayalis are very critical. And, every now and then I get a letter that says, I listened to your audiobook. The way you said that was slightly off, which I took as a compliment because, I don't think I speak Malayalam as fluently as I might. And so I'm not surprised. But I tried my best. And so it's been a real delight to see the audiobook get so successful. You're a runner. I guess you're listening to it while you run. Yeah, so I listen to more audiobooks when I walk than I actually read books. But to get to the emotional scenes, I think that those scenes are emotional. When I was writing some of the death scenes, I revised them 50, 60, 100 times, who knows? But every time I came to that critical place, I would tear up. And so when we were recording the audiobook, I mean, there were several times that there's 3 people in the studio. It took us weeks. There's me, the producer, and the audio technician. We were all in tears. We were all, literally in tears. My voice is choking up. And so we had to pause and then pick up and continue. So I think if you sense some emotion, there definitely was a lot at many different moments. And, I think that's par for the course. I'm not embarrassed about it. I tend to tear up pretty easily. But, I think that sort of tells you how interesting it is that, this made-up story can be so moving. I think it was Camus who said that fiction is the great lie that tells the truth about how the world lives. So if you create a scene that feels truthful to the reader, to you, it has to convey the emotion. It has to be connected to the emotion that you brought to it.
I'm absolutely not embarrassed to admit that I am running with tears streaming down that face as I am listening to you read, particularly that section. I've been told that it's time for audience questions, but before that, I would absolutely be failing.
By the way, I would ignore that because we started late. Half the people here showed up late because they thought it's the wrong session. Apologies for that. So let's just go as long as we want to. How's that?
Absolutely. I think I may have somehow, because of how emotionally overwhelmed I was by the novel myself, I may have given everyone the impression that this is entirely a serious novel. But some of the comic sections of the novel are some of the most incredible.
Anti-what?
Some of the comic sections.
Is it anti?
No, I said it's a very serious novel. Some of the comic sections of the novel are among the most incredibly funny bits I have read. 2 particular characters come to mind. One is Uplift Master, and the other is the Broker Onion. And they make for extraordinary comic relief in the novel. And I wonder how it is that you draw that out.
Yeah, so, my mother's manuscript, I actually did not draw on it more than just for a mood, a sort of sense of things. But I drew on it for that anecdote because my mother described how at the Maraman Convention, which I don't think I need to explain to this audience what the Maraman Convention is, do I? No. So, but for the few people who are visiting from elsewhere, it is the biggest religious convention in India and perhaps the world, where people gather on the banks of the Pamba River for like a revival convention in tents that go, all the way down. And in the early years, they would have outstanding speakers like Stanley John and Billy Graham had been invited. But the problem is you have to translate for these speakers. And so they would have these people positioned in the audience the guy on the stage would do the translation, the guy back of the tent would pick up the translation and repeat it. And then in the next tent, that repetition would be conveyed. And so by the time the thing arrived,
like Chinese whispers,
it would be completely distorted. But then when they did get microphones, and they had a translator, I sort of took the liberty of having the translator decide, to change the meaning of what was being said by the white preacher from Corpus Christi, Texas. And so that was a lot of fun to write. I'll tell you, my mother and father were scandalized. They thought that I was being irreverent and sacrilegious by having this happen at the Maraman Convention in this way. And so I didn't tell them, but it's still in there. Nevertheless, they didn't like that they thought I was making fun of the convention. I'm not. It was just an attempt at some humor.
And the broker character as well, which not a lot of people know that there are such things as marriage brokers, and that's such a brilliant character and also very wise, I think.
Yeah, interesting. So Broker Onion is this marriage broker, and I remember when I was in medical school in Madras, I came for my niece's engagement. She was getting engaged, or one of my nieces, and I was sitting there at the engagement ceremony, and there's great food being passed around, and I found I was sitting next to the broker, the marriage broker, and everybody was eating, samosa, whatever was being passed around. He ate nothing. He was attentive, like laser focused on every little child and individual floating around. He was clearly filling his catalog for future reference. And I remember being very taken by that. But the lessons that he conveys, I actually learned from one of my business school colleagues who told the story in a classroom, in a class I was attending, of how, when he came to his mother and said, I've had all these girlfriends and hasn't worked out, I'm ready to marry. She said, okay, I'm going to help you. We'll find a mate. But this is how we're going to do it. First, we're going to set the date. Most people think the most important thing is to find the right person. No, you set the date. If you set the date, you're committed. And she used the example, if you're going to start a medical practice, are you going to wait for the first patient to come before you put up your board and hire a building and all that? No, you have to do those things first. So set the date. That's where I got that from.
And I have to ask you to tell us all impediments are.
Sorry?
The all impediments.
All impediments are minor impediments. Yeah, that's one of his rules. You can always make a marriage work. Horoscope and all that, you can fudge it just a little bit.
And minor impediments are not impediments.
Exactly, yes.
Okay, let's take this to the audience. I think there's a mic floating around. I see lots of hands up. Let's go to the lady on the second row, please. Oh, okay. Sorry, go ahead.
Hello. Hello, sir. The Covenant of Water is the last book I read. So it's very...
Hold it closer. Yeah.
So Covenant of Water is the last book I read. So it's really fresh in my mind. So I was really excited to be part of this conversation. And I'm a little bit sad I wasn't aware of the change in timing. So
neither was I, but yeah, here we are. Okay.
So I missed a little bit of your conversation in the beginning. So my question is, the story has many elements. It goes from 1900s to 1970s, pre-independence struggle, India's independence struggle, post-independence, and there is a family saga at the crux of it, the caste history of Kerala, all of these elements. I wanted to know what came to you first. Which part of the book is where you started the idea from?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I began with the idea of a young 12-year-old bride on her wedding day going to meet her bridegroom. And by the way, I think that was a very risky way to start the book, especially for English language readers, most of whom are actually in the West. And this is a shocking idea for them. And they sort of have the sense that disaster is going to unfold. There may be many readers who stopped reading at that point, for all I know. But this was actually the true story of my great-grandmother. She married at the age of 10 an older widower who had a couple of kids. And yet, to everybody's surprise, she went on to have a couple of children with him. They had the happiest marriage. They were supposed to be a hilariously funny couple, a model. And so I like the idea of beginning with that scene and playing against the grain to create this wonderful love story, which is what it is. Thank you for that.
Sorry. Can the mic be...
Microphone over here, please.
Yeah.
Hi. I have a question. I've read, of course, both Cutting for Stone and Covenant of Water, and though both the books are sprawling epics, there's something very personal about both the stories, and they're obviously coming from a very personal space. The other thing that's very similar to both the books is they're both covered by like this mist of divinity. There's a lot of divinity in your pages. So what is your relationship, or what is your view on God? I'm very curious to know.
Thank you so much for that, Moses. By the way, if you don't know, that is Moses, a wonderful actor, director, screenwriter, doing many different things. But this was not a setup. I didn't know you were going to ask me that. I will say that people, because of this book, project on me. They just imagine that I'm very religious or that I'm trying to proselytize in some way. but I'm really not. I think I am envious of the kind of faith of my forefathers. And I was simply trying to be true to the times. And it was characteristic of my grandparents, characteristic of my parents, that they had a kind of faith that I'm envious of, but I recognize in the rituals some strong sense of a bond. And, as I get older, when I go to church and hear the Malayalam service, but also big chunks of it are in Syriac, which, neither my parents nor anybody else, maybe the priest, understands. But the words are familiar and they sort of invoke a very special feeling amongst all of us. So, yeah, I'm not particularly spiritual in the way that I understand it. I was just trying to be true to the times in both cases. Both are very old Christian nations, Ethiopia and India.
I think we can probably take one more question. Where is the mic right now?
We have many hands up. I think where the microphone folks are protesting, don't want a handout, but we're protesting too.
Good evening, Dr. Verghese. An absolute privilege to listen to you. It took me 6 months to read this book, The Covenant of Water, and no book has impacted me so profoundly. So much so that when I went on a trip to Mahabalipuram, I was in fact looking at it through the eyes of Digby and Celeste. So what I wanted to know is, you've taken over a decade to write this book. So do the characters still linger in your mind beyond once you finish the story? Like, do they shape your thoughts and perspectives even after you're done with the book? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think they do. They become so concrete for me. And mind you, the reason that the book took so long is in part because I think the real art of writing in my mind is revision. And it takes revision until these characters become three-dimensional people who are alive to you. And there's another question that I know someone out there wants to ask is, did I know the whole story before I started? And I thought I did. I put it on a big map in my living room. I had outlined on a whiteboard the whole story. But what would happen is once I had a really good three-dimensional character, there's a very famous saying in writing circles that character is defined by the decisions taken under pressure. So that's true of life, by the way. You put people under pressure, they make a decision, it tells you a lot about them. So every time I'd put my characters under pressure, they would sort of indicate to me, I would never do this. You're kind of silly if you think I would do this thing, And so I would have to go in a different direction, erase the board, start all over again, and point in another direction. So, yeah, I think the characters are still very much alive to me. They're like people that I haven't seen in a long, long time. I have great difficulty reading any of my books again, because every time I read them or try to read them, my instinct is to pull out a pen and make some corrections. It really gets in the way of actually reading the book. And so I think I have to wait to be old enough where I don't have that reflex anymore. So I would like to go on. I think there are many people who have just arrived who thought they were here to hear me. How many of you thought that my session was starting at 4? Well, I'm very sorry. They just changed this on us. I don't know what to do about this, and I would keep going, but I don't want to be unfair to the next writer who's going to be on the stage. May I just say in closing, to thank our wonderful host. She's the chief editor at Penguin. I know she doesn't look like she is, but she is. I also want to thank all of you. I want to say that I was very nervous about Malayalis getting a hold of my book, because Malayalis are, as you know, I'm not telling you anything new, very critical people. We're very quick to shoot things down. And one of the most gratifying things for me has been to see how, in general, Malayalis have embraced the book as being something that explains them to the world, if you like. It was not my intention, but it's been a very welcome thing. I'm very grateful to Govind, Ravi DC for having me here and getting to visit with all of you. I hope I get to see you in the book signing tent. So Thank you, everyone.
And the Malayalam edition is out now.
Sorry?
And the Malayalam edition is out
And the
now.
Malayalam edition is out as well, so that's just wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.